in a way, after one has been in mania, which is having access to the power of the universe moving through the human nervous system instead of just the low power voltage of ego thought programs running through the human nervous system, then one has had one's power taken away from the universe. And when that happens, a lot of times we're rendered non-functional. So it can almost feel like reward and punishment from the universe. But it's not actually reward and punishment, it's just learning. We're all learning, and that's why I think self-dialogue is important, to just continue to learn. Any way to just continue to learn could be useful, whether it's self-dialogue or any way that one is able to learn with oneself, for oneself, and unfold understanding. Maybe it's just in talking to other people. It could look very different for different people. But if we're always learning and understanding, then that is the reward, and there's no punishment in that. But there might be some learning that feels like punishment. So this whole idea of a low power double bind in terms of being labeled isn't necessarily a double bind, but it's low power. So we have low power, and so how to raise the power in our nervous system is one thing, and one of the powers is actually communication. So when we're in that high state of so-called mania, we're communicating a lot, we're receiving a lot of information and communication, and we're trying to move that communication through our nervous system, and we're not able to do that, and eventually it sort of shuts off that communication, and all these ego programs flood back in, and then we're totally in chaos, and then we're captured and pathologized in some way. But really it's trying to connect with this other communication, which is a communication to be shared. The ego communication we think is just our own and internal, and our own personal identity and our own private thing. So then when we get in touch with this other communication, it's to flow between people and species and everything. It's not meant to be kept for oneself. So then when we try to express it and others can't see it, it sort of blocks that communication, because it's something to see and act. Not just reenacting ego thought programs, but see and act and say and share and see together. But it's not really happening that way. And when we do eventually land in a psychiatrist's office or something, they're just listening in order to do something to us, not see what we're saying. So the low power is from not being able to communicate. So if we can communicate even just with ourselves, we will build power in our nervous system, and then that communication can trickle out without ever thinking, oh, I have to go out and communicate this. It will just happen naturally. And we might think, well, talking to ourselves is kind of silly, but we do that all the time in our head. So if we can actually, instead of having these loops going on in our head, unfold understanding through insights in daily life and give voice to them and make more understanding, then it's a different movement of just keeping it in one's head for oneself, because that's what we do with our ego. And when that breaks down and we really want to see and share, when we're not able to communicate that and see and share with people, then that process breaks down, and then we get lost in the ego again. So it's really important to be able to get this feed forward loop of communication going. And we can do that first with ourselves. Just like when we're training for a race that we might be in with thousands of people, we're first training with ourselves. We're by ourselves. We're lifting weights. We're running. We're doing all these things to train ourselves up for the real thing, the race. So this, in a way, is like training, because we've been so trained in all these other ways, and we're entrained by media and TV and everything, and we're not able to powerfully communicate because we're just passively receiving all these communications and just being entrained, really. And when we're entrained, we're subject to that level of consciousness that is entraining us, whether it's a TV show or media, or even the entrainment of buying into psychiatry on a long-term basis. So I feel like just like our body can make any biomolecule on the inside that we can make on the outside to take to create that state, like LSD creates expanded consciousness. Well, the universe energy can come in and expand our consciousness. We don't need to take LSD, it's just a way to do that. Or we can take some kind of molecule to make us happy, but the body can also make happy molecules inside. And when we keep taking things from the outside, our body is less able to make it for itself. So I actually learned by taking melatonin every night, my body was probably stopping making melatonin. So I stopped taking melatonin because then my body will start making it again. So if I'm looking outside to get happy molecules or taking things to be happy, then my body's less able to just make those naturally. And not just make them naturally all the time, but make them on order, right in the instant that it's necessary for that. So it's about mirroring the moment, not just always trying to be happy or whatever. But so in the same way, we can think to ourselves, oh, I need to expand my range of acceptable behavior. But of course, there's also always a universal process that can do that for us. So we can think, my ego needs to consciously do this. Or there's also a process in the universe that does this without our conscious will whatsoever. Most people don't ask to go into so-called mania. It just happens. And then since it happens and we don't consciously, willfully do something, we think something must be wrong. But really, it's just the universe can do anything we can do artificially to induce what the universe can do, and the universe can do it a hell of a lot better than we can. But then we come in and try and corrupt and distort the process, and then at the same time make millions of dollars selling the happy molecule that we can make ourselves if we would just understand ourselves and what's going on in this process and other processes, of course. So-called mania and psychosis even show us that our range of behavior, not even acceptable, remove the acceptable, is vast. It's vastly greater than what we experience now as ourselves. So then when those behaviors that come in that are outside the range of what we consider ourselves, we think something else must be doing it, we must be out of control. When really all these programs are what control us from not being expansive. So by releasing that mechanism, we're more expansive. And what happens in a way is we expand into all these wonderful, beautiful, magical behaviors, and then we contract back, and then we see our potential for some of the worst possible behaviors. And some people do end up acting some of those things out because it's very confusing to be in that sort of universal attunement process and see the possibility for those behaviors but not act them out. And that's part of why I talked about how even in the good, it's good to not get too involved in acting all of it out, because it's about seeing the possibilities and maybe having an understanding that anything's possible, but waiting for that state to be over before we again sort of reattach with the illusion of free will and then can go about slowly unfolding some of these possibilities. Because if we decide to act in the most beautiful possible state and do something beautiful in a moment, then we might decide to act in the most awful feeling of possibility state and harm somebody or ourselves. But really, acting in those states where we might harm someone or ourselves is the same as acting in the state where we might do something super beautiful. And I'm not saying any of it's right or wrong. It's just really understanding that we have to be careful acting in states that we're not ready for. It's showing us our range, but it doesn't mean that those are the ones that we will consistently be acting out as. So there's a range of society, and then we go way outside the range on either side of so-called good and bad. But when we come back to the range of society, we still don't want to go to that extreme good or extreme bad. Obviously not the extreme bad, but we can still sort of consciously move outside that range of society. and perhaps into a different range that might create a different life for ourselves. So it's almost like designing one's life through one's gestures and also through what one puts in front of oneself. And not just puts, but when something is in front of us, there's so much that could be made salient. So by unfolding understanding, we'll make what is salient based on our understanding. And if we just understand ourselves as bad and mentally ill and defective, well, we're going to pick out those bits in our reality all the time, and it'll just be confirming that. When there's a whole range of what we can do and gesture out as our life, and when we believe that we're defective, we're just going to keep gesturing in defective ways because we have that in our beliefs. And another thing that I've learned and discovered is that by taking all these toxic medications, we're not really seeing the moment properly. So even if we're able to act in a good way, it's still building up some kind of stress because we're not quite seeing the moment. In that, for example, say I'm on medications and I'm in this sort of benign situation and everything seems good and I'm just kind of going about the day and I just sit there and twiddle my thumbs, and that's a good day. And then if I'm not, I might be in the same situation and see somebody that needs help and I might get up and help them, or I might speak up against something that I see isn't quite right. So what I'm saying is the medication blocks some communication. And I just gave those examples. It's not a good or bad or right and wrong thing. It's just we're missing information when we're being numbed out by medications, which could be good for a certain period of time, of course. To have too much information is stressful, but to be able to learn to communicate some of these informations that we receive, they don't get stored in us, they don't build up. But I also feel like when we're on medications, there's still part of us that is seeing these things that we could have said, but we didn't say them, or we didn't act, or we didn't, whatever. We've just kind of narrowed our acceptable range of behavior to just sitting in a chair and twiddling our thumbs all day. But part of the body and mind and nervous system and heart knows there's a lot more we could be doing. But we just don't quite know how to communicate that. And by communicate, I don't just mean words. I mean like even the way we sit, or even the way we talk, the way we're able to look at people or not. So just to numb out the body so we just can sit and stare at a wall and get through the day, the mind and heart know, especially if we've been calibrated to some of these other areas of behavior that are very beautiful, and some of the more dynamic and positive elements of the possibility of being human, and we're sitting and staring at a wall. That's an extreme example. The mind and heart knows that we're not moving in our possibility, and we're just sort of being more in a state of doing nothing to stay safe. And then, if we try to do something, people might interpret us as dangerous. And we're not dangerous. We might be dangerous to the structure of society if we start making meaning and communicating as some of these energies that we're able to perceive. When our ego structure is scrambled, we're able to see a lot more and speak as that, not just speak as our limited ego and memories and blah, blah, blah. There's a much more dynamic way to communicate, and we're trying to get in touch with that. Or something is trying to get in touch with us. It's knocking at the door of our ego and asking it to open the door and let us in and rearrange the furniture and maybe tear down the whole house and build a new one. And Adam Galinski said, there's two ways to expand. You seem powerful in your own eyes, which to me is something that can happen in self-dialogue, or you seem powerful in the eyes of others, and they will grant you a wider range. So if we're able to powerfully communicate with others, they will sense us as more powerful. If we're able to powerfully communicate with ourselves, as these energies will sense ourselves as more powerful, we'll grant ourselves a wider range of behavior. And there's also a question of if we want to be accepted by a society that would just pathologize us And it's not a matter of fighting that, but just creating something else where we don't have to think about this concept of being accepted. And he talked about the mama bear effect, where women get just as good of results as men when advocating for others. So it's interesting how it's okay for women to advocate for others, but they can't advocate for themselves. And that could be seen as negative, but there's a little bit there in that women are just probably a little bit more selfless, and we need more of that selfless energy in the world. And hopefully I can advocate for others by sharing myself at some point. And he said when we advocate for others, we discover our own voice. And I definitely am discovering my voice. I don't think I'll ever discover it. It's a matter of always moving and discovering it fresh and anew, and not clinging on to any of it. And he also said perspective taking is one of the most powerful tools we have to expand our range. And to me, that relates to how in map consciousness, really that is about infinite perspective taking. We no longer have just the perspective of our limited egocentric consciousness. We become world-centric, ethnocentric, and cosmocentric as well. And we can take all these other perspectives, and that's part of the recalibration and reattunement of the human nervous system to operate having a nervous system that is an empathetic mirror of the moment and not just a regurgitator of memories and programs and keeping oneself feeling separate and divided from everything. When one doesn't feel separate and divided, one automatically just takes perspective without trying to think, I have to take perspective. So just like I said before, we can think, I need to learn to take perspectives, or I'm going to try to take perspectives, or we can realize the universe can just make us do that too, in map consciousness and with that extra energy, which is the power, which just expands the ranges of behavior and also the perspective taking at the same time. So all these people that make these clever little ways of thinking about moving willfully, the universe can do beyond us having any sense of free will or control. And when that happens, we just have to learn a lot faster. So we can do it through the intellect, like step 1, do this, step 2, take perspective, step 3, blah, blah, blah. Or, I don't know what the or is, but I know the or for me is just being in that state of map consciousness. And it's like accelerated learning of these ideas that people come up with intellectually through the study of science. But the real study of science is having a scrambled ego and being so naked and vulnerable in the moment that one really has to figure it out for oneself, moment to moment. It's sort of like playing a video game for the first time. We've never played it before. We have to figure everything out for ourselves, moment to moment. We still have an idea because we played other video games. We have a human form. We still have an idea about what it means to be human to some extent. We can walk, move our arms, we can do all these things, but it's a completely different game. And we have to learn moment to moment. And just like in the video game, if you lose a life in a video game, you just start again. So if we get to the ceiling of map consciousness and bottom out in so-called psychosis, well, we can start again. It's sort of like getting to the end of the level and having to start again, or just losing a life in a game and then starting again. And then with video games, when we play the level a few times, even if we don't make it to the end, eventually we do make it to the end, and it gets easier each time. It's just like being in a new game in the nervous system where we can't rely on all our past programming to inform us, which means we have to be so awake, so alert, so clear. And it's pretty difficult to do that every moment, but as soon as we are again, we're again moving in that field. So it's a matter of an instant of moving in the field of thought and programs to moving in the field of perception, action, understanding, meaning, clarity, etc., etc. So so-called mania or magic is increasing perspective taking, and it's a power and energy that increases our range of behavior. Forget the word accepted. Accepted implies reward and punishment, and really freedom is moving beyond reward and punishment. So when one is able to stepwise increase the power in one's own nervous system, one eventually is free from even feeling like one's behaviors need to be acceptable according to this reward punishment program. Just like in mania, we don't really care about that until we're eventually punished by psychiatry, and then that scares us for sure. But we can eventually move into something beyond that. And then it's just communication, it's just beauty, it's just movement, it's just life.